Rex Kane had seen enough war to know when someone was about to make a terrible mistake. The alien commanders sitting around the holographic display table were making one right now, and they didn't even realize it. The old human admiral kept his mouth shut and watched. His weathered face showed nothing as the Althurian generals pointed their six-fingered hands at star charts, discussing defensive positions like they were planning a formal dance. These tall, blue-skinned strategists had been winning battles for 3,000 years. They knew war the way humans knew breathing, or so they thought. Kane shifted in his observer's chair, feeling the weight of 40 years in uniform. His gray hair was cropped military short, and scars from a dozen conflicts marked his hands. He was here as Earth's military attaché, nothing more. The other species tolerated his presence because protocol demanded it, but they rarely asked for his opinion. The Christek representative, a being that looked like living glass, projected tactical data into the air. Its voice rang like crystal bells as it spoke about energy shield frequencies and quantum disruption fields. Kane had to admit their technology was impressive. Humanity had learned much from the Christek since joining the Galactic Defense Union 5 years ago. But technology wasn't everything. The Gorvani war chief growled something in his native tongue. The massive, bear-like creature stood 8 feet tall and could probably tear apart a human tank with his bare claws. His people had conquered half their galaxy arm through pure physical superiority before joining the coalition. When he spoke, his translator rendered his words in a deep, rumbling voice that made the deck plates vibrate. Kane understood why these species had formed their alliance. Each brought something valuable to the table. The Althurians had strategy and patience. The Christek had technology beyond human understanding. The Gorvani had strength and courage that bordered on madness. Together they had kept peace in this, part of the galaxy for centuries. But peace was ending. The enemy they faced was like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. The briefings called them the Void Swarm, though Kane thought that name was too clean for what they really were. These things weren't alive in any sense the coalition understood. They were machines, but not built by any known intelligence. They seemed to have existed since the galaxy was young, sleeping in the dark spaces between stars. Something had woken them up 6 months ago. Nobody knew what. The first sign had been the silence from the Kepler system. An entire star system with 12 billion inhabitants had simply stopped communicating. When the coalition sent scouts, they found something that defied explanation. The planets were still there, but they had been changed. Stripped of their atmospheres and oceans, their surfaces covered with geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The inhabitants were gone. Not dead, not evacuated. Gone, as if they had never existed. More systems followed. The Void Swarm moved through space like a plague, consuming everything in their path. They didn't seem to want territory or resources in any conventional sense. They wanted matter itself, breaking down entire worlds and rebuilding them into more of themselves. Kane watched the alien commanders debate their response with growing frustration. They spoke of honor and proper military conduct. They discussed acceptable casualty rates and rules of engagement. They planned campaigns like they were playing chess with a civilized opponent. The swarm didn't care about their rules. Kane had read every report, studied every engagement. The coalition had lost 12 systems already, despite having overwhelming technological and numerical superiority. The problem wasn't their weapons or their tactics. The problem was their thinking. These species had grown comfortable with war. They fought according to patterns established over millennia. They had codes of conduct, traditions, and expectations about how civilized beings should behave during conflict. Even their most brutal campaigns followed certain unwritten rules. The Void Swarm followed no rules at all. An aide approached Kane's chair. The young human woman whispered urgently in his ear, and Kane felt his blood turn cold. New reports were coming in from the front lines. The swarm had broken through the Coalition's defensive perimeter at the Meridian Cluster. Humanity's newest colonies were directly in their path. Kane stood slowly, his joints creaking with age and old wounds. The alien commanders continued their debate, unaware that the situation had just become much worse. He cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. It was the first time he had spoken in today's meeting. The Althurian general looked at him with barely concealed irritation. These beings valued proper procedure above all else, and interrupting a strategic session was considered extremely rude. Kane didn't care about their manners anymore. He told them about the breakthrough at Meridian. He watched their faces change as they realized what this meant. The swarm was now moving directly toward human space, and there wasn't enough time to redeploy the main Coalition fleet. The Christek representative chimed like breaking glass. The Gorvani war chief roared something that didn't need translation. The Althurian generals began rapid calculations, their fingers dancing over holographic displays. Kane waited for them to reach the obvious conclusion. The Coalition would have to abandon human space. They would fall back to more defensible positions around the core worlds and prepare for a proper campaign. Humanity's colonies would be sacrificed to buy time for a strategic response. It was the logical choice, the smart choice, the choice that any experienced military commander would make when faced with impossible odds. The Althurian general turned to Kane with something that might have been sympathy. His voice was formal and carefully neutral as he explained the situation. Humanity's forces would remain to conduct a fighting withdrawal, slowing the swarm's advance while the Coalition prepared their real defense. Kane nodded slowly. He had expected this. The alien species saw humans as crude newcomers who had stumbled onto the galactic stage barely a century ago. Earth's military was respected for its determination, but nobody considered human tactics particularly sophisticated. They were about to learn otherwise. Kane requested permission to return to the human fleet immediately. The alien commanders granted it without question. They probably thought he wanted to help organize the evacuation. As Kane walked toward his shuttle, he thought about the reports he had been filing for the past year. Detailed observations of Coalition military doctrine, careful analysis of their strengths and weaknesses, comprehensive assessments of their technological capabilities. Nobody had bothered to file similar reports about humanity. That was their first mistake. Kane's shuttle undocked from the Coalition flagship and turned toward the human fleet. Behind him, the alien commanders continued their planning, secure in their knowledge and experience. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. The message from Admiral Beth Morrison arrived while Kane was still in transit. 3 words, transmitted on a channel the aliens couldn't decode. Gloves are off. Kane smiled for the first time in weeks. Morrison had been his student at the Naval Academy 20 years ago. Back then, she was a brilliant young officer who asked uncomfortable questions about conventional warfare. Now she commanded humanity's deep space fleet, and she was about to show the galaxy what humans really meant by war. Kane's shuttle docked with the human command ship just as the first reports started coming in. The Coalition's long-range sensors were detecting unusual activity in human space. Ships were moving in patterns that made no tactical sense. Civilian vessels were broadcasting evacuation orders, but they weren't heading away from the swarm's advance. They were heading toward it. Kane made his way to the observation deck where a group of alien military observers had gathered. The Coalition leadership wanted first-hand reports on humanity's fighting withdrawal, so they had embedded officers from each species with the human fleet. Kane could see confusion on their faces as they tried to understand what they were seeing. The Althurian observer, a young strategist named Vel, approached Kane with visible distress. His blue skin had taken on a sickly purple tint, which Kane had learned indicated extreme anxiety in his species. Vel gestured at the tactical display showing human fleet movements. His voice trembled as he asked Kane to explain what the human commanders were doing. Their ships were spreading out across multiple star systems instead of concentrating for a defensive stand. Worse, they were stripping resources from their own colonies and loading them onto vessels that were heading directly into swarm territory. Kane looked at the display and saw something beautiful. Humanity was preparing to fight the war they knew, how to win. The first sign that something had changed came from the Titan system. Human mining operations there had been evacuating for days, but instead of running, they were doing something else entirely. The massive asteroid mining platforms were being converted into weapons, fusion reactors were being overloaded, ore processing facilities were being packed with unstable materials, and the whole operation was being aimed at the approaching swarm fleet. When the Void Swarm entered Titan space, they found what appeared to be easy prey. Massive industrial installations floating in space, broadcasting human distress signals. The swarm moved to consume them, just as they had consumed a dozen other systems. The mining platforms exploded with the force of small stars. Kane watched the sensor readings as the explosion ripped through the swarm formation. The blast was so powerful it actually damaged ships several light minutes away from the epicenter. But more importantly, it sent a message that echoed across every communication channel in human space. Humanity was not retreating. Humanity was fighting. The Christek observer chimed in alarm as more reports flooded in. Human colonies across the frontier were implementing something called Protocol Scorched Earth. Instead of allowing their worlds to be consumed by the swarm, they were destroying everything themselves. Entire cities were being evacuated and then vaporized. Orbital installations were being crashed into their own planets. Agricultural worlds were having their atmospheres stripped away by their own inhabitants. The alien observers couldn't understand it. These humans were destroying billions of credits worth of infrastructure, wiping out decades of development, making their own worlds uninhabitable. It was madness. Kane tried to explain, but he could see they didn't really comprehend. These alien species had rules about warfare. They had concepts of acceptable losses and proportional responses. They fought to control territory, to gain resources, to achieve political objectives. Humans fought to survive. The Gorvani war chief, a scarred veteran named Tor, at least understood the concept of total commitment. His people respected strength, above all else, and there was something in humanity's complete dedication to destruction that spoke to his warrior soul. But even he seemed disturbed by the reports coming in from human space. Entire families were volunteering for suicide missions. Civilian freighters were being loaded with experimental weapons and sent on one-way trips into swarm formations. Human. Engineers were volunteering to stay behind on worlds that were about to be destroyed, just to make sure the demolitions went off properly. Kane received a personal message from Morrison during the battle for the Ross system. Human defenders there had allowed the swarm to land on the planet's surface, then triggered a series of geological weapons that caused the planet's crust to collapse. The entire world had been turned into a trap, killing billions of swarm units, along with every human who had volunteered to stay behind. The message was simple. Swarm advance has stopped. They're trying to figure out what we are. That night, Kane found himself in the ship's observation lounge with the alien military observers. They sat in stunned silence, watching the tactical displays that showed the aftermath of humanity's defense. The swarm had indeed stopped their advance, but the cost had been horrific by any civilized standard. 18 human colonies had been completely destroyed, not captured, not evacuated, but utterly annihilated by their own inhabitants. Millions of humans had died in the past week, most of them civilians who had volunteered for missions with no chance of survival. But the swarm's advance had not just stopped. It was actually reversing. The Althurian observer, Vel, spoke quietly about honor and the proper conduct of war. His species had codes that governed military behavior, rules that had been developed over thousands of years of civilization. What humanity was doing violated every principle of civilized warfare he had ever learned. Kane poured himself a drink and tried to explain something that he wasn't sure he understood himself. Humanity had spent most of their history fighting each other. They had developed ways of warfare that other species found disturbing because they had been forced to. When your own survival was at stake, when extinction was the alternative, you learned to do things that civilized beings found unthinkable. The Christek observer chimed a question about human psychology. How could an entire species coordinate such extreme measures? How could millions of individuals simultaneously decide to sacrifice everything? Kane thought about humanity's history. The wars that had shaped them, the disasters they had survived, the challenges that had forced them to adapt. Other species had evolved in more stable environments. They had time to develop philosophy and ethics and rules about proper behavior. Humanity had evolved to survive. The reports kept coming throughout the night. Human ships were attacking swarm formations with tactics that made the alien observers physically sick. Crews were ramming their vessels into enemy units at near-light speed. Experimental weapons were being deployed without proper testing, often killing their own operators along with the target. Human soldiers were volunteering for surgical procedures that would let them interface directly with captured swarm technology, even though the procedures had a 90% fatality rate. But it was working. The swarm, which had seemed unstoppable, was actually retreating from human space. For the first time since the war began, the enemy was showing something that might be called hesitation. Kane finished his drink and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, humanity was transforming itself into something the galaxy had never seen. They were becoming exactly what the situation required them to become. The alien observers were beginning to realize that they might have been wrong about humanity. The question was whether they were prepared for what humans were becoming in response to this war. Kane suspected they weren't. 3 months after the swarm's first retreat, Kane stood in a medical bay watching something that should have been impossible. Commander David Park was lying on an operating table while human surgeons carefully implanted pieces of captured swarm technology directly into his nervous system. Park was awake during the procedure. He had insisted on it, claiming he needed to monitor the integration process. Kane could see the man's vital signs on the monitors around the table, and they were anything but stable. But Park kept talking to the surgeons, guiding them through the process of connecting alien machinery to human biology. The procedure had a 12% survival rate. Park was the 47th volunteer. Kane had been documenting humanity's transformation for months now, and he was beginning to understand why the alien observers had stopped filing reports. What humanity was becoming defied every category the galactic community used to understand warfare and technology. The first breakthrough had come at the Battle for New Geneva. Human forces had managed to capture several intact swarm units during a boarding action that cost them 3 ships and 2,000 lives. Most species would have studied the captured technology for years before attempting to use it. Human engineers had reverse-engineered basic functions within a week, but they didn't stop at reverse engineering. They started improving on it. Kane watched as Park's surgery concluded. The man's body was now integrated with swarm communication technology, processing, systems, and something the human scientists were calling adaptive architecture. Park would be able to interface directly with swarm systems, assuming he survived the integration period. Dr. Lisa Wang, the lead researcher on the Human Enhancement Program, approached Kane while the medical team prepared Park for recovery. Wang was a small woman with intense eyes who spoke about technological advancement the way other people discuss the weather. She had been working without sleep for 6 weeks, surviving on stimulants and pure determination. Wang explained what they had learned from studying the swarm. The enemy wasn't just a collection of machines. They were something more like a distributed organism, with individual units that could share information and adapt to new situations instantly. Traditional tactics didn't work against them because they learned from every encounter and modified their approach accordingly. So humanity was learning to do the same thing. Kane followed Wong to her laboratory, where teams of human researchers were working on projects that would have taken other species decades to complete. They weren't just studying swarm technology anymore. They were hybridizing it with human systems, creating weapons and tools that combined the best of both approaches. The results were disturbing and impressive in equal measure. Human soldiers were volunteering for procedures that replaced portions of their brains with swarm processing units. Human ships were being rebuilt with living metal that could repair itself and adapt to different types of damage. Human weapons were becoming intelligent, capable of learning from each battle and improving their effectiveness. But the most significant change was in human strategy itself. Kane received a briefing from Admiral Morrison about humanity's new approach to the war. They were no longer fighting defensively, trying to protect their territory from swarm incursion. Instead, they were actively hunting swarm formations across multiple star systems, using tactics that the enemy couldn't predict because they changed constantly. Human forces had become modular and adaptive. Individual ships and units were given broad objectives but allowed to determine their own methods. This meant that no two human attacks used the same approach, making it impossible for the swarm to develop effective countermeasures. The alien. Observers were becoming increasingly disturbed by these developments. Kane found them in the ship's conference room, huddled around reports from the front lines with expressions of growing horror. The Althurian observer, Vel, showed Kane footage from the recent battle at Proxima Station. Human forces had arrived to find the system already partially consumed by the swarm. Instead of attempting to retake the station, they had done something unprecedented. They had begun consuming it themselves. Human ships equipped with modified swarm technology started breaking down the station's structure and using the raw materials to construct new weapons and vessels on the spot. Within hours, humanity's small attack force had doubled in size by literally eating the battlefield. The Gorvani war chief Tor was impressed by humanity's ruthless efficiency, but deeply troubled by their methods. His species valued honor in combat, courage in the face of death, loyalty to one's companions. What humans were doing violated every principle of warrior conduct he had ever learned. Human soldiers were abandoning wounded comrades if it meant completing the mission. Human commanders were sacrificing entire units without hesitation if it provided tactical advantage. Human engineers were creating weapons that were as dangerous to their own forces as they were to the enemy. But most disturbing of all, humans were beginning to win. Kane received reports from across the front lines showing swarm forces in full retreat. The enemy that had seemed invincible just months before was now avoiding direct confrontation with human forces whenever possible. Several swarm fleets had actually abandoned star systems rather than face human attack. The problem was that humanity wasn't stopping at driving the enemy away. Commander Park had survived his integration surgery and was now leading raids deep into swarm-controlled territory. His enhanced abilities allowed him to interface directly with enemy systems, turning swarm units against each other with devastating effectiveness. But Kane could see that Park was no longer entirely human. The man's thought patterns had changed. He spoke in mathematical concepts and tactical probabilities. He made decisions based on pure efficiency, rather than human emotion or morality. Park was becoming something new, something that combined human creativity with swarm logic. And he wasn't the only one. Kane walked through the ship's corridors and saw more evidence of humanity's transformation. Crew members with modified bodies that could survive in vacuum, engineers with enhanced nervous systems that let them process information at superhuman speeds, soldiers with weapons that were permanently integrated into their bodies. They were still human, but they were also something else. something the galaxy had never seen before. Dr. Wang found Kane in the observation deck and shared her latest discovery. The enhancement process wasn't just changing individual humans. It was creating connections between them, forming a kind of collective intelligence that allowed coordinated action on a massive scale. Humanity was becoming a hive mind. Not in the same way as the swarm, Wang explained. Humans retained their individual personalities and decision-making abilities. But they were now connected by a network that allowed instantaneous communication and coordinated action across entire fleets. Kane realized that he was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history. Humanity wasn't just adapting to fight the swarm. They were evolving into something that could replace them entirely. The question was whether the rest of the galaxy would survive the transformation. Outside the observation windows, Kane could see human ships heading toward their next target. The vessels looked nothing like they had at the beginning of the war. They moved with organic fluidity, their surfaces shifting and changing as they traveled. They were beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Kane began composing his report for the coalition leadership. He suspected it would be his last one. Soon, there might not be a coalition left to report to. Humanity had found a way to break the galaxy's forces. The problem was that they might break everything else in the process. Kane felt the ship shudder around him as humanity's deep strike force dropped out of faster-than-light travel. Through the observation windows, he could see their destination, a structure so massive that his mind struggled to comprehend its scale. The swarm's primary construction facility, built around a captured black hole, stretched across several million kilometers of space. The humans called it the Forge. Captain Robert Stone had volunteered to lead the assault, along with 3 million other humans who knew they probably wouldn't survive the next few hours. Kane had tried to understand what drove such massive numbers of people to volunteer for certain death, but the answer always came back to the same thing: survival of the species. Humanity had calculated that destroying the Forge would end the war. They had also calculated that the mission would require more resources than they could spare, and more lives than any reasonable military doctrine would allow. So they had stopped being reasonable. Kane watched the tactical displays as humanity's attack force spread across local space. What approached the Forge wasn't a traditional fleet in any sense the galaxy would recognize. It was a swarm of small, adaptive craft that moved and thought as a single organism. Over the past 6 months, humanity had learned to fight by becoming something very much like their enemy. The individual ships were barely larger than fighters, but there were millions of them. Each one was crewed by humans who had undergone the enhancement process, their nervous systems integrated with the ship's systems so completely that the boundary between pilot and machine had essentially disappeared. Commander Park's voice came over the communication system, though Kane wasn't entirely sure it was still Park speaking. The man had undergone so many modifications that he was more cyborg than human at this point. His words came in mathematical patterns that the ship's computer translated into concepts Kane could understand. The assault was beginning. Kane felt the ship accelerate toward the Forge, and he realized they weren't just observing this battle. They were part of it. Every human vessel in the fleet, including the command ships, was equipped with the new hybrid technology. If needed, they would all become weapons. The swarm's defenses were unlike anything Kane had ever seen. The space around the Forge was filled with automated defense platforms that fired weapons capable of destroying small moons. Energy fields that could disrupt matter at the molecular level created barriers hundreds of thousands of kilometers wide. Swarm patrol fleets numbering in the tens of thousands moved to intercept the human attack. But humanity had learned something important about the swarm during their months of warfare. The enemy was predictable in their perfection. They calculated optimal responses to threats and implemented them with flawless efficiency. This made them nearly impossible to defeat using conventional tactics. But humans weren't using conventional tactics anymore. Kane watched as the human swarm hit the swarm defenses like water hitting stone. Individual human ships were destroyed by the thousands, but the overall formation simply flowed around the obstacles, adapting and changing faster than the enemy could respond. When defense platforms destroyed entire squadrons, the remaining ships learned from the deaths of their comrades and adjusted their approach. The human formation wasn't trying to overwhelm the defenses through superior numbers or firepower. They were learning from them, adapting to them, and eventually incorporating them. Kane saw human ships begin landing on swarm defense platforms instead of attacking them. The crews, enhanced with hybrid technology, started interfacing directly with the enemy systems. Within minutes, entire defensive installations were turning their weapons on their neighbors. The swarm responded by attempting to shut down the compromised platforms, but humanity had anticipated this. Human engineers had developed viruses, specifically, designed to spread through swarm networks, turning the enemy's own efficiency against them. The more connected the swarm systems were, the faster the human infiltration spread. Captain Stone's boarding force reached the forge's outer hull after fighting through defenses that should have been impregnable. Kane watched through the ship's sensors as human soldiers began cutting their way inside the massive structure. But what he saw defied everything he thought he knew about military operations. The humans weren't just fighting their way into the facility, they were consuming it. Stone's enhanced soldiers could break down the forge's materials at the molecular level and rebuild them into tools and weapons. As they advanced through the structure's corridors, they literally ate their way forward, converting enemy technology into ammunition and equipment. The boarding parties were growing larger and better armed with every meter they advanced. Kane realized that humanity had learned the swarm's most important lesson. Matter was just another resource to be converted and used. The difference was that humans could do it faster and with more creativity than the original builders had ever imagined. The battle for the forge's core lasted 18 hours. Kane monitored the progress through reports that became increasingly difficult to understand. As the human enhancement process advanced, the soldiers fighting inside the facility were changing in real time, adapting to the environment and challenges they encountered. When they finally reached the central control chamber, Captain Stone was no longer recognizable as the human who had started the mission. His body had been almost entirely replaced with hybrid technology, and his consciousness was distributed across multiple systems throughout his squad, but somehow he was still Stone. The moment that changed everything came when Stone's team successfully interfaced with the Forge's primary systems. Instead of destroying the facility, they took control of it. The massive construction apparatus that had been building swarm units began producing human ships instead. Kane watched his instruments as thousands of new vessels began streaming out of the forge. They were unlike anything humanity had built before, combining human creativity with swarm efficiency in ways that should have been impossible. The ships moved like living things, their surfaces rippling and changing as they adapted to local conditions. But more importantly, they were reproducing. The captured facility wasn't just building ships. It was building shipyards that could build more shipyards. The exponential growth that had made the swarm so dangerous was now working for humanity instead of against them. Kane received a priority message from the coalition leadership. Their long-range sensors were detecting the massive change in the strategic situation. For the first time in the war, the swarm was in full retreat across all fronts. But the coalition's excitement was tempered by a growing concern about what humanity was becoming. The alien observers on Kane's ship had stopped asking questions. They sat in the conference room, staring at displays that showed human forces expanding across space at rates that made their governments nervous. The species that had once dismissed humanity as crude newcomers were beginning to realize they might have created something more dangerous than the original threat. Kane found himself alone in the observation deck, watching as humanity's new fleet spread across local space. The ships moved in perfect coordination, their actions guided by the collective intelligence that had emerged from the enhancement process. They were beautiful and terrifying in their efficiency. Admiral Morrison contacted Kane personally as the mission concluded. Her voice carried a mixture of triumph and something that might have been regret. Humanity had won the war, but the cost had been their original nature. They were still human, but they were also something new, something the galaxy would have to learn to live with. Kane began composing what he suspected would be his final report as a military observer. The war was effectively over, but the peace that followed would be far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Humanity had broken the galaxy's forces, but in doing so, they had broken the galaxy's understanding of what was possible. Outside, the observation windows, human ships continued to pour out of the captured forge. Kane tried to count them but gave up when he reached the hundreds of thousands. Tomorrow there would be millions. Next week there would be billions. Humanity had learned to multiply like their enemy, but they had retained something the swarm never possessed, the ability to choose what they became next. Kane hoped they would choose wisely. The Galactic Security Council chamber had never hosted a hearing quite like this one. Kane sat at the witness table, facing representatives from 47 different species, all of them trying to understand what humanity had become. 6 months had passed since the swarm's complete destruction, but the galaxy was still struggling to adapt to the new reality. Behind the curved seats of the council members, massive displays showed the current state of human expansion. Red dots marked human-controlled systems, and there were a lot of them. Humanity had not scaled back their operations after winning the war. If anything, they had accelerated their growth. The Althurian counselor, an elderly being whose blue skin had faded to pale silver with age, spoke first. His voice carried the formal weight of 3,000 years of galactic law, but Kane could hear uncertainty beneath the diplomatic language. The counselor wanted to understand humanity's intentions now that the immediate threat had passed. Kane had been preparing for this moment since the war ended. His final report on human capabilities ran to over 800 pages, documenting the complete transformation of an entire species in less than 2 years. But sitting here, facing the collective leadership of galactic civilization, he realized that numbers and analysis couldn't capture what had really happened. The Christech representative chimed a question about human population growth. Their sensors indicated that humanity's numbers had increased by 300% since the war began, despite suffering massive casualties during the conflict. This should have been impossible given known human biology. Kane explained as simply as he could. Humanity had learned to accelerate their own reproduction using modified swarm technology. The process wasn't quite cloning and wasn't quite natural. Reproduction. It was something new, something that let them create new humans with the memories and skills of existing ones while still maintaining individual personality and creativity. The implications were staggering. Humanity could now replace losses faster than they occurred. More importantly, they could create specialists designed for specific tasks. Need 1,000 expert engineers? Humanity could build them in weeks. Need 1 million soldiers trained for specific combat scenarios? That was just a matter of resource allocation. The Gorvani counselor, a massive creature whose scars spoke of countless battles, asked the question that Kane knew was at the heart of this hearing. What did humanity want now that they had won? Kane looked around the chamber at faces that represented every major civilization in the galaxy. Some showed curiosity, others fear. A few displayed something that might have been admiration. But all of them were waiting for him to explain whether humanity posed a threat to the existing order. The honest answer was that nobody knew, including humanity itself. Kane testified about his observations during the war's final months. Human forces had continued evolving even after victory was assured. The collective intelligence that emerged during the conflict hadn't disappeared with the end of hostilities. If anything, it had become more sophisticated, allowing coordination between human populations across hundreds of star systems. But this wasn't the hive mind that other species feared. Kane had visited the rebuilt human colonies, talked to the enhanced soldiers, interviewed the scientists who had led the transformation. Humans remained individuals with their own thoughts, desires, and disagreements. The enhancement process had simply given them the ability to work together with unprecedented efficiency when necessary. The problem was that this efficiency made other species nervous. Kane showed the Council recent footage from human space, cities that rebuilt themselves overnight using adaptive construction technology, ships that could modify their own design based on mission requirements, soldiers who could interface directly with any technology they encountered, learning to use alien systems faster than their original builders could explain them. A Centauri counselor asked about humanity's military intentions. Their long-range sensors showed human fleets conducting exercises at the edge of known space, testing weapons and tactics that pushed the boundaries of known physics. These weren't defensive preparations. They looked like preparations for expansion. Kane had to choose his words carefully. Humanity wasn't planning to conquer other species in any traditional sense, but they were expanding, exploring, and claiming territory at rates that other civilizations found alarming. The problem was that human expansion looked threatening even when it wasn't intended to be. The enhanced humans could terraform worlds in months rather than decades. They could establish self-sustaining colonies with minimal initial resources. They could adapt to environments that would kill other species without requiring special equipment. This made them incredibly successful at colonization, but it also meant they were competing for resources that other species needed. Kane testified about humanity's attempts at diplomatic outreach. They had offered to share their enhancement technology with other species, but the offers had been politely declined. Most galactic civilizations weren't interested in transforming themselves the way humanity had been forced to. This created a fundamental problem. Humanity had become something new, but they were still trying to exist within a galactic community designed for the old version of what they had been. The result was increasing tension and misunderstanding on both sides. The council session continued for 3 days. Kane answered hundreds of questions about human capabilities, intentions, and psychology. He provided detailed analysis of their technology, their social structures, and their long-term goals. But the most important question came on the final day, from an unexpected source. A young Arthurian aide, barely past adolescence by his species' standards, asked Kane what he thought humanity would do if the galaxy tried to contain them. The chamber fell silent. This was the question everyone had been avoiding, the scenario that kept galactic leaders awake at night. Kane looked around the room and saw fear in too many faces. He told them the truth. Humanity had spent their entire existence adapting to threats and challenges. They had learned to survive ice ages, global wars, and the transition to space exploration by becoming whatever the situation required. If the galaxy treated them as a threat, they would probably become one. But Kane also shared something else he had observed during his final weeks with the human fleet. Humanity's transformation wasn't permanent. The enhancement process was voluntary and reversible. Many humans were already choosing to return to more baseline biological states now that the immediate crisis had passed. The collective intelligence that had emerged during the war was becoming less centralized, more distributed. Humans were retaining their enhanced coordination abilities but using them more selectively. They were choosing when to think and act as a unified species and when to embrace their individual nature. Kane's final testimony was a warning and a recommendation. Humanity had become something unprecedented in galactic history, but they were still learning what that meant. The galaxy could treat them as a threat and probably create the conflict everyone feared. Or the galactic community could find ways to accommodate a species that had fundamentally changed the rules of what was possible. The vote, when it came, was closer than Kane had expected. 26 species voted for peaceful integration and cooperation with humanity's expansion. 18 voted for containment protocols that would limit human growth and technology sharing. 3 abstained, unsure which path offered the best chance for galactic stability. Kane left the council chamber, knowing that he had probably witnessed a turning point in galactic history. The vote for integration had won, but barely. Humanity would be given space to continue their development, but they would be watched carefully by neighbors who still weren't sure what they had become. 3 months later, Kane found himself back on Earth for the first time in 5 years. The planet looked nothing like he remembered. Cities had been rebuilt using adaptive architecture that could modify itself based on population needs and environmental changes. The sky showed evidence of massive orbital construction projects that dwarfed anything humanity had built before the war. But in the small town where Kane chose to retire, life looked surprisingly normal. Children played in parks that could have been from any point in human history. Families gathered for meals, couples fell in love, artists created beauty for its own sake. The enhanced humans looked exactly like the baseline ones, and their enhanced abilities were used for mundane purposes like growing better gardens and building more comfortable homes. Kane rented a small house with a view of the mountains and began writing his memoirs. Every morning, he watched the sunrise paint the peaks in brilliant colors, and every evening, he saw spacecraft moving across the sky like new constellations. Humanity had retained their ability to appreciate simple beauty, even as they gained the power to reshape worlds. The children playing in the park could interface with technology that surpassed anything the galaxy had seen before the war. But they used those abilities to create more elaborate games of tag and build more impressive sandcastles. They were still human children, just with capabilities that previous generations could never have imagined. Kane's final entry in his journal was dated 6 months after his return to Earth. He wrote about watching a group of enhanced humans working together to repair storm damage in the local community. They moved with perfect coordination, their actions synchronized by the collective intelligence that connected them, but they also laughed at jokes, stopped to help elderly neighbors, and took breaks to admire a particularly beautiful sunset. Humanity had broken the galaxy's forces by becoming something new, but they had also retained something essentially human that no amount of enhancement could change. They were still the species that reached for the stars because they dreamed of something better, not because they wanted to conquer anything. Kane closed his journal and looked up at the night sky. Somewhere out there, human ships were exploring regions of space that no one had ever seen before. They were building things that would have been impossible before the war, solving problems that had puzzled galactic civilization for millennia, and probably creating new challenges that nobody had anticipated. But they were also sending messages home about the wonders they had discovered, sharing their adventures with the communities they had left behind, and planning to return someday with stories of what lay beyond the edge of known space. Kane smiled and went inside to prepare for bed. Tomorrow would bring new reports from the frontier, new evidence of humanity's continuing evolution, and probably new concerns from their galactic neighbors. But tonight, he was content to be an old soldier in a small town on a planet where children still played games and adults still fell in love. Humanity had broken the galaxy's understanding of what was possible. Now they were building something new with the pieces, and Kane was curious to see what shape it would take.